Hey, what's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in today's video. I want to share with you today this painting process. Now, what I wanted to do is combine a reference photo or a subject that's a little simpler and easier to draw and paint, but then put a lot of emphasis on getting that semi-realistic feeling to really be accurate. During this process, I actually took multiple pictures of the painting, turned it black and white, compared it to the black and white reference photo, just to make sure I'm kind of in the area and some of that realism will be preserved. Hope you're going to enjoy this one, and let's get to it. So I'm starting with the drawing stage. I'm not going through anything time-lapsed here. It's all going to be a real-time tutorial. So if you get bored of the drawing stage, feel free to skip ahead. I think it's about around 3 minutes. Now I'm setting up the horizon line. That's the first step. I just want to make sure that it's kind of the same height from the right and the left, meaning it is indeed horizontal and not vertical. Now I'm going to put that mountain ridge more to the left side, actually. So instead of having it reach all the way to the center right, I'm keeping it to the left. Don't know why. That was kind of a spur of the moment decision. I could have done it differently. Now I'm going to put in that river or small lake, not lake, river probably, and or channel even. And the big thing you want to remember here is to keep things very horizontal as well. The reason is things in perspective kind of get squashed, and you will see me fixing that because it's kind of a mistake I made of stretching it out too much. If you actually look at the placement of each curve in that channel, it is much more squeezed because, you see, here I go, I squeezed it up a bit because we're looking at it kind of from a lower vantage point, meaning we're just a person taking a picture and that's it. The more we look at it from above, the more stretched it would seem. But this time I really wanted to squeeze it a little more tight. So I'm starting to put in some details on the mountain ridge just to figure out what it looks like, where the major shapes are going to be. The way I recognize it, there's kind of a darker section and then a lower section below that is of similar value to the ground. And again, it was important for me to create a somewhat realistic impression here. I wanted to challenge myself a bit. And that usually comes down to the values. You see here I am squeezing the curves a little more to make sure it looks like we're looking at it from the right angle. It's a big challenge, and no matter how much you practice it, sometimes you end up making these mistakes. It's a very dominant bias of our mind to see these things. So in any case, putting in some of these patches of grass and rocks within the channel. Now what you will see me do is slowly improve the shape of that river by adding the edges of it, okay? And that's how I usually work my shapes. I start from large to small. So if you notice, I started with the horizon line, which divides it into the sky and the land, which are the two largest shapes. Then I put in the main shape of that channel of water, and only then I start indicating those different smaller details that are the riverside. In this example. Yeah, I guess I could call it riverside. And this is pretty much it in terms of the drawing stage. What I'm going to start doing now is establishing the initial wash, kind of an underpainting. Now, I'd like to keep this one organic when it comes to colors. Again, the realism will come more from the values and getting those right and the details. But the colors, I'm gonna go for something similar, but a little different. So it was important for me to have a stronger blue patch in the sky, and you will see me do that. But I want them to be organic feeling in that I want the blue to have a bit of the yellow and red, and I want the yellow to have a bit of the blue and red. So every color here is, no color is completely pure. Every color is a little muted using the other primary colors I'm relying on, and that gives it a very coherent and cohesive kind of together feeling that the entire painting ties together nicely. Okay, now as I get to the land, I'm starting to put a bit more yellow to the mix. The main concern here is not to go too dark with the water, because the water reflects the sky, and I have to make sure I keep both fairly light. That's where the feeling of three-dimensionality and depth will come from, the right contrasts, the right values. Okay, so I'm putting in the river
with a fairly light touch. So here I go. And around that, I'm going to start building the land. Now around, closer to us, you see it gets a little darker. So I'm kind of establishing that using some more paint. And again, around the river, I'm going to start placing in some yellower, maybe a bit of red here and there, patches of color, just to get across that that warmth of the field, okay? And again, the color is secondary here. Most of the realism is going to be achieved using the correct values, okay? So if you get everything the right darkness or brightness or lightness rather, it will create the impression you want. And as I mentioned, I had to several times take a picture of my process, compare it, really compare it to the reference photo, try and figure out where I didn't go dark enough, where I went maybe too dark, where I'm missing some details. All of these things are very important to make sure that the eye doesn't need to guess anything. Okay, it just sees and it understands and it feels realistic. Now, my apologies, I forgot to turn on the camera. My emphasis with this process was to be as present to it as possible. So I just started painting, didn't notice that I need to turn on the camera, so my bad about that. What I basically did is put a bit of yellow up top and then slowly charge it with more colors. So a bit of blue, a bit of red, and then I continued working on the fields that are closer to us with mostly yellow, and now I'm working on the side of the river, which has mostly green in it. Okay, so I'm trying to have the green and yellow to work together nicely. And I'm treating this entire left section as one big shape, all the way from the mountain and up to the foreground. And I'm going to do the same on the left side. And I'm actually using the river as a separation between the two to make the painting process easier. So I don't have to work on the left and right sections simultaneously. I can actually work on one, finish it, and then work on the other thanks to that separation. Now I'm going to take a sip of my cup of tea. I talked so much today. I recorded a lot of videos and narrations and things for the course, which is going to be done soon. So good news, update on that soon. So here's the riverside that's a little more green and lush, while the actual fields are a little more yellow, muted. Now these are things I will have to play around with in the next washes. It's not going to be perfect with this one. I am trying to make the most out of it, which means all of these sections and the reflections, I'm going to attempt to mix a bit of a darker value using my blue in red and try and get that feeling of shadow near the side of the river and also near the ripples themselves. So you see me going a little darker and starting to establish some of the shapes of the ripples. This is actually where you want to be a bit careful. You can kind of wing it, but if you do want to get a more of a realistic result, it is important, at least for the details that are in the foreground, to be a little more slow and measured and make sure you get them right. Mostly with these ripples, you want to make sure that the reflections, not ripples rather, the reflections here are fairly horizontal. You want to get them horizontal. Then they go a little diagonal. You'll see later on. But for now, keep them as horizontal as you can. Okay, and all of this happens while the wash is still wet and I can still rework it. That's a pretty major part. Now I'm going to start working on the right section soon, and here you see a bit more orange or red, and I wanted to have that be visible. So I'm starting here with some of that yellow, but this time I injected a little more red to it. Now, one thing you want to pay attention to is, even though the river makes a separation, you still want the colors on the right and left sections to be kind of similar. The reason is you don't want it to feel like two different paintings. You do want to have that feeling of togetherness on the right and left sections as well. It's a very common mistake to miss that effect. So you will see me, even though I'm adding a bit more red, slowly adding a bit more green and yellow down below to make it a little more similar to the left section. Now look at how much my mix moves in the palette. It's very wet, and I have to have it that way if I want to ensure that I get an even wash, that I have enough time for wet and wet, that I can work at my own pace and not be too stressed over my edges drying on me and all of that. So that's something to pay attention to. Keep things very flowing, even if it's too wet and it ended up drying too light, you can always glaze on top of it another layer. Okay, I love when I'm able to go dark from the beginning, but sometimes that's just not really an option for larger washes because you do have to compromise the darkness for flow. So instead of going very dark and struggling with keeping a large wash feeling even, you have to go lighter, as light as possible that will still be dark enough, and then do another layer and another layer. That's especially true for larger paintings, and as you can see, this isn't really that large. It's kind of an A4 size, I would say. But anything larger than that, if you go A3 or larger, it really starts being a challenge, and you will find yourself compromising that way. If you have a small dark area, that's great, because you have a better odds of getting it to be dark enough. But when it's larger, it's a bit hard. And this is what I find challenging about these earlier washes, is that you have larger ground to cover. Later, afterwards, it's kind of more focused on the small details. You have more reaction time and so on. So it's not as complex. Now, as we get closer to us, again, I'm cranking up that slightly more green and more muted. The riverside, again, is a little darker, so I wanted to capture that effect. Now, you will notice I kind of messed up the shape here. I should have added that grassy patch, separate to the riverside itself. There should be like, it should be a part of the river, and I kind of messed that shape up. That's fine, not the end of the world. I will attempt to fix it later on. By the way, there's crazy wind outside. I hope it doesn't come through the video, but things like actually fall down the street. This place is never really prepared for strong winds and storms. But in any case, yeah, you see, so here I should have made a separation. So I'm just putting in more water into it to kind of blend it out, and then I'm picking it back up with the brush, but that's fine, not the end of the world. I will fix it later on by adding some darker values. Now look at all these beautiful green patches in the foreground. I'm really keen on getting those in, because that's what gives a lot of the atmosphere to the scene here, those greens. And you want to make sure to avoid patterns, so don't put them in equal distances. Be sure to spread them out. That's one of the main things for landscapes and cityscapes, and it's a big challenge how to make all of these ripples and details random. That's a pretty big part of it if you want to get that organic feeling. And it's a very common mistake. People have the tendency to create patterns. So you start painting a row of trees and they're all the exact same height, the exact same size, the exact same shape. That's something you want to avoid, especially in nature. I'm not talking about artificially created foliage that decorates stuff and is of perfect shape. I'm not talking about that. I'm really talking about the natural landscapes. And that's something you really want to pay attention to. Now I'm kind of adding some ripples to these patches of grass within the water. These are going to play a pretty major role, in fact. Should have made one of them larger and one smaller, but that's fine. They are going to play a bit of a major role in leading us into the scene, because here's the trade-off. When you're doing this kind of a scene, again, nothing is too complex when it comes to the drawing and everything. There isn't like a car in the middle or a person or even not a major prominent tree. So it's a little easier on the one hand, but on the other hand, you're kind of grasping at straws to create some kind of a focal point. It's very even, and you are running the risk of having the viewer not know what to focus on or feeling like there isn't a strong enough of a focal point. So the way to remedy that is very often to add all of these smaller details in the foreground. And look at all the blades of grass that I added in the foreground. And that really will pull the viewer's attention to that area. Now I need to explain what I'm doing now. I actually took a picture, compared the values, and saw that the right section should be a little darker. So I'm glazing with a pretty wet wash because I don't want this to be too dark. I just want it to be a little darker. And also I added a bit more red to it. Now, looking back, it may be a little too dark, but just a little. I'm still fine. The thing with yellows and greens they're misleadingly darker than they actually appear very often. So you look at this and you think to yourself, oh, it's like a wheat field, or not a wheat field, but it's the color of wheat. It's yellow, so it must be super light. While actually it's much darker than the sky. It's much, much darker. So you get a very pure mid value. It's not mid to light. It's not mid to dark. It's kind of a pure mid value. And that can be very misleading. But you will see this fall into place once I add a few more details, and once I start rendering the mountain ridge in a bit more detail, it will start making more sense, trust me, okay? Now, as always, while I have a wet wash, I want to make the most out of it. So I'm starting to put in those greens, and I'm fixing the edges for the river. As long as the wash is still wet, you can add more, you can remove, you can do a lot of things. For example, there's a kind of a light patch at the back that I'm adding by just touching the brush with some water. The brush is wetter than the paper, and you see how this kind of spreads out the water. One thing I should have done is just splash a bit of water on it. It would have created a beautiful grass-like effect, but I didn't want to go crazy with this one. Wanted to keep it fairly accurate and realistic, though I should have done more of that, I think. It would have created a very nice impression and a bit more movement, dynamic movement within the large washes. So my bad. You see a lot of artists do this very often, and it's a beautiful effect. Now I'm starting to render this darker area on the mountain. I will have to blend some of its edges. Where the mountain has this rounded shape. You see it's kind of a rounded shape, hill, valley kind of a thing. Here I go, blending some of these shapes, thinking about the walk I need to take Ruth on soon, and hopefully it won't rain on us. And yeah, and right now we're kind of in the middle of the process. We're at a point where I still need to clarify some things and then add some details, and we're basically done. Now the clarification stage is the more important one. Now you see there's this line, it's either a road or something like that that cuts through and makes a nice separation. By the way, it should have been green between the mountain and the land, so I wanted to get that in there. There are actually people walking there. If you check out the original reference photo, as always the link is in the description box, you will be able to zoom in a lot and you will see there's like a row of people going on a hike. Now I'm starting to put that little dead tree on the left section. It is important for me not to have it be too sharp. I do want some of it to blend into the background, so I'm kind of blending its branches and leaves onto the ground. And that's something I can later spray some water on, maybe use my brush to kind of blend into the background, because notice it's not too prominent. So you see I'm using my brush to spread it out a bit. The branches and so on are still clear enough, but I kind of blended it into the left section. Okay, and now I have a few more details to add to that left section. A bit more green and darkness in the foreground, a bit more darkness on the mountain. You see, it's a bit hard to tell, but I actually looked at a black and white version of this photo, and the entire mountain was just a tad bit darker than the ground. Which is what I'm doing here. It looks a little strong, but you'll see once it dries, because it's a very wet wash. So it's a little misleading, it looks darker. It's gonna dry much lighter, and then you'll be able to see that the separation is very subtle. And slowly this starts taking shape, okay? One of the main things is the left section here, is where it requires most work, adding the ripples, adding some of the details on where the grass is. There's quite a lot to get done there, actually. Now, you will see there's a bit of a lighter patch there at the very horizon, almost at the horizon. So I'm just lifting that. A bit wet water from the brush, a bit of a tissue, and it should lighten it just a bit, very gently, nothing too serious. And now it's time to go back to that left section and start rendering some dry brush marks to create the feeling of some grass. Felt a little too empty. Should have probably used my tiny rigger brush also to add some details, but that's fine. And I also checked, and it actually should be darker. So I'm doing two things here. I'm darkening, and I'm also using that opportunity to add some details. Very loose and kind of easygoing details, but still details nonetheless that are important and that are visible. What you want to make sure is you control your edges. So once I put that, I want to have some of them kind of blended. So I go back with the brush, I kind of blend some of them, connect them with the wash that was previously there. By the way, notice the right section, how beautifully the row of water I put there previously created that lighter area with some backgrounds that actually look natural and nice. Backgrounds can be used beautifully in these kinds of paintings to create, like the cauliflowers can actually look like blades of grass or different plants or trees. So that's a really cool effect to try and develop. It's something I need to dive deeper on. I'm definitely not doing enough of it currently. And I'm starting to add the people and some trees in the far distance. I considered blending some of it into the background, like having a blurry background. But I looked at the reference photo and I decided to stay a little more loyal to it than usual. Otherwise, I would probably have blended the left side of the mountain ridge. I did decide to go a little closer to the original with this one, a decision that I think was the right one. For what I wanted to practice and for what I wanted to try. And I think this is a lesson in terms of, again, selecting references. Go with something humble in the beginning. Like this to me is a fairly humble scene. It's very organic. There are a lot of organic shapes, grass, water, very clear shapes. It's a very clear message in a way. There are some easier references, don't get me wrong, like if you paint a single apple or something like that, like a still life arrangement that's very simplified. But I am talking in comparison to people, portraits, cityscapes. This one's fairly emptier and a bit easier to interpret as a beginner. So I would recommend something like this. And if I feel like I'm kind of going off the deep end and really going crazy with very difficult references, and I feel like I can't get them to look like I want, or I know that I could do better, I like to once in a while go back to a simpler scene. And instead of focusing on drawing something spectacular and painting something spectacular, I focus on painting something good and painting in a good process, using a good process. So that's that. Now I'm putting in those all important ripples. They will make a pretty huge impact on the balance of the scene. You will notice they will bring the foreground to the actual foreground. It will feel much, much better. Now, I want you to pay attention to the mountain ridge. Look at how much lighter that lower section of it became. Once it dried, it fell into context. It looks so much better. One thing I do want to improve, and again, I did not work on it enough during the years, what is the colors. Because I'm such a value painter in a way and I focus on the values so much, I feel like I have a lot to improve in terms of colors and in terms of understanding how to getting the right color. So right now, if you look at the original, the yellow parts are much yellower. So that's something I need to figure out how to achieve with watercolor. With oils and acrylics, it will be easier because I'll just mix the paint until I get the one I want. In watercolor, you have to bring into consideration the different glazes and how things look once layered one upon another with the transparency. That's the big challenge. It is something I'll try going for. I may do another go at this scene to try and crack that code because that's really something I have a lot of work to do on. There's always so much to improve. Trust me, it's no matter how much you work and how much you improve. And the skills, there's always something to learn. I look at artists that have been doing this for a few decades now, and for me it's been, 7 years, 6 years, something like that. So much to learn every day. And I've not been practicing enough lately because I'm doing a lot of other artistic things too, like people, figures, illustration, all of that. So yeah, now I feel like the riverside is a little uneven in its height in the reference photo, and I made it a little too kind of patterny like. So I'm trying to make it a little messier by darkening some spots. Look at this beautiful part to the most left where you see some blades of the yellowy kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, weeds maybe, coming through from the shadow. It's a really nice look that I wanted to maybe potentially add later on with some opaque paint. So I just wanted to make that shadow a little larger, make it a little more random feeling, because it was a little, again, too patterny, too pattern-like, and that's not good for what I'm looking for. Okay. So yeah, mixing some very dark paint, using the side of my brush to get in some texture around the foreground. You see that when I looked at the photo, it looked a little darker there, so I'm kind of touching it and retouching it to get to the right value. Now, the one thing I need to be careful about is not going overboard and ending up making this a little too complex and too messy with all the different shapes and the colors and the values. So I'm very careful and trying to be very aware of what this does to the scene overall, which is why I'm kind of adding, then maybe I'm spraying some water on it, as you've seen me do, blend some of it with some tissue, just to make sure that it works and doesn't ruin what came before it. Now I'm just patching up this shape because it's a little tighter in the reference, so I wanted to close that gap just a little bit. Now, if you look at the shape of my river, I fell to the trap of, again, stretching it a bit. It should be flatter, but that's fine. I will improve for next time. I do have to admit, for this process, I was much more focused than other ones, and you can see me kind of working slower, really figuring out each and every section, not trying to simplify everything like all across the board, but rather really thinking about the different areas, and I think it made a big difference. Focus and dedication and slow, kind of careful work can have a pretty big, I forgot how to talk again, pretty big impact on the painting, even regardless of like whether you improve your skills or not, So one of the main things that's left now is just to add the final details. So you will see there's a bit of that kind of a line there in the background, but most of the details are going to be in the foreground. Okay, there are going to be a lot of blades of grass just near the bottom, and they're very visible. You see me putting them now, very visible. I'm just using some green and some yellow. I know I didn't talk much about the colors, but it's basically yellow ochre, French ultramarine, Quinacridone Rose. It's these very basic colors I use for pretty much everything. They lead to a very organic and natural feeling result, especially the yellow ochre and French ultramarine and all of that group of paints. As opposed to phthalo blue, that's a little more dominant, and lemon yellow. I find these to be a little more natural and a little more suitable for my taste. And you see these little grass patches make a big difference. They immediately pull our eye to that, and in essence what we did was turn this section into the focal point. This lower left section of the river, it's what gets us into the painting, what keeps us moving into the distance, getting to the mountain and all of those small kind of supporting shapes. But yeah, I think that looks good. I think there's a good balance there. I will say, again, the colors is something I'd like to improve. Here I go, just adding a few of these, again, opaque. It's not straight out of the tube. I'm just using my yellow ochre. It's a very soft paint, so you can actually wet it and then really dig your brush against it and get these beautiful opaque touches without using it straight out of the tube. You can do that in the pan after it dried, and you actually get something. Which is a part of why I also like this shape a lot. This color a lot. So yeah, just a few more touches, a few more blades of grass, and we're pretty much done. I'm going to sign this real quick, and I will remove the tape to show you the final result, which I know a lot of people like to see, and I get it. It looks better, especially for these kinds of landscapes, because they fill the entire page up. It's not just something small in the middle of the page. It actually makes a difference seeing it framed. And really look at how important that last stage was of putting in those touches of blue in the bottom left corner. After seeing this process again and narrating it, I do think I'll have another go at the scene, and this time my lens would be, so to speak, to paint the yellows very bright and to put a little more emphasis on the colors. It's one of those things that I just did not devote enough time to, and I think can really improve my work. I do want to be able to make something bright and really strong, even though that's not necessarily the look I always go for, or more often go for. Now let me show you some of the details up close. All of these blades of grass were kind of important. And here it is. I really hope you enjoyed this process. Now let's wrap it up.
So this is it. I really hope you enjoyed seeing the process and seeing it come together. I, during this process, took a lot of breaks, took pictures of the painting, turned it black and white, compared it to a black and white version of the reference photo to really make sure I'm getting there and I'm getting closer, which is why you saw me fixing this area, making it a little darker here and there, adding those very important ripples in the foreground that really bring the sense of depth to life. A lot of small corrections. It is sometimes about a lot of small touches here and there until the impression you're interested in is created. Not always will you actually compare it to the reference photo. Very often you'll just look for a kind of impression. For me, I knew that I wanted to stick close to the reference photo, which is why I did that. One last note, don't forget my frustration-free watercolor course is currently at a 15% discount, so be sure to check it out. A kind of a Christmas sale promotion, which means $24 instead of $29. It will put a link in the description box below. Thank you so much, and I will see you again in the next vid.